Season 1 of Breaking Bad introduces high school chemistry teacher Walter White. While celebrating his 50th birthday, Walt reflects on all of the ways his life has gone wrong, and he has failed to reach his fullest potential. He feels like he gets no respect from his pregnant wife Skyler, teenage son Walt Jr., his chemistry students, or even his boss at a car wash that serves as the demoralizing second job he needs to pay his bills. And when Walt is diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, he realizes the sad legacy he will leave behind. Walt then learns from his pompous brother-in-law, DEA agent Hank Schrader, of the large amounts of money that can be made from selling drugs. While on a ride-along with Hank, the DEA bust a meth lab and arrest the cook Emilio, but Walt witnesses a second culprit escape. Walt recognizes the man as Jesse Pinkman, a troublemaking and drug-addicted but ultimately well-meaning former student. Walt tracks down Jesse and proposes a partnership where Walt will use his knowledge of chemistry to make the most pure crystal meth on the market, while Jesse will use his drug-dealing connections to sell the superior product. While making meth in an RV out in the desert, Jesse brings in his contact Crazy 8 to distribute Walt's product. Unfortunately, Crazy 8 brings along his cousin Emilio, who recognizes Walt from the DEA raid and assumes the drug deal is actually a setup. As Crazy 8 and Emilio attempt to kill Walt and Jesse, Walt uses his chemistry skills to create a poisonous gas. Emilio is killed by the gas, but Crazy 8 survives. As Jesse reluctantly follows Walt's instructions to dissolve Emilio's body in hydrofluoric acid, Walt tasks himself with finishing off Crazy 8. Walt finds the task of committing murder to be impossible for him until Crazy 8 attacks him and Walt is forced to kill him. As Walt spends more time with Jesse and their meth business, Skyler begins to grow suspicious. To explain his behavior to his family, Walt finally reveals his cancer diagnosis and begins chemotherapy. Unaware of her husband's burgeoning drug-dealing career and worried of the financial ramifications of his chemo treatments, Skyler reaches out to Walt's former colleague Elliot Schwartz. Walt and Elliot had formed a company together out of college known as Gray Matter, but Walt left the company and sold his stake for a mere $5,000 after breaking up with his lab assistant fiancée Gretchen. Elliot and Gretchen then got married, and Gray Matter went on to thrive in Walt's absence, using his original research to gain a valuation worth billions of dollars. Despite Elliot and Gretchen's offer to pay for Walt's chemo treatments, Walt refuses the financial help due to his own pride and ego. And so Walt tasks Jesse with finding a bigger distributor for their meth so they can bring in more money fast. Jesse then sets up a partnership with local drug lord Tuco Salamanca. While meeting with Tuco, Walt creates the persona of Heisenberg, a mysterious, cool, imposing threat. Everything Walt wishes the world saw him as. Heisenberg impresses Tuco by fearlessly standing up to him, and the drug lord agrees to pay $70,000 a week for meth. Needing to cook more than ever before, Walt and Jesse are forced to steal barrels of a compound called methamphetamine in order to keep up with Tuco's demands. This new process of cooking gives Walt's meth a blue coloring, which soon becomes infamously dubbed Blue Sky by its users. Meanwhile, while looking into the disappearance of Emilio and Crazy 8, Hank and the DEA uncover the rise in popularity of the mysterious Heisenberg's Blue Sky meth. Hank realizes its quality is so superior to all others that Heisenberg could become the new kingpin of meth in all of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I want to cut in real quick and tell you about this video's sponsor, Gentle Bands. For centuries, men's rings have had the same boring look, but Gentle Bands has completely reimagined the ring to create a handcrafted piece of art that allows you to express your unique style. They use a whole bunch of awesome different materials to craft their rings, like spacecraft titanium, whiskey barrels, and Hawaiian koa wood. I have the Matador ring, which is made with extremely durable tungsten and contains actual fragments of dinosaur bones and meteorite. I use this as my wedding ring, and it's kind of cheesy, but I love that it contains all of these elements that represent a bond that's durable and timeless and transcends space and time. And also, what guy doesn't want to wear actual dinosaur bones on their finger? Gentle Bands also values their customers' input. Knowing that people work with their hands on the job, but also want to protect their one-of-a-kind ring, they've created these awesome chains that allow you to take your symbol of commitment with you at all times. So go ahead and order your Gentle Bands ring now. They deliver straight to your door in some super cool packaging, and they even offer a free engraving service. And if you click the link in the description and use promo code RECAPCHILLS, you'll get 25% off your order. That's promo code RECAPCHILLS for 25% off your incredible new one-of-a-kind ring. Thanks so much to Gentle Bands for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the recap. In Season 2 of Breaking Bad, Tuco Salamanca proves himself to be a violent and erratic business partner, even beating his own Lieutenant Nodos to death. After assigning his other Lieutenant Gonzo to dispose of Nodos's body, Gonzo's arm is crushed in an accident and he bleeds to death. As Hank, his partner Steve Gomez, and the rest of the DEA discover the bodies, they begin an elaborate manhunt for Tuco. Knowing his days in America are numbered, Tuco kidnaps Walt and Jesse and takes them to a hideout with his mute and paralyzed uncle, Hector Salamanca. Tuco awaits for his cousins to arrive and transport them all to Mexico, where Walt and Jesse will be forced to produce their blue sky meth non-stop. Skyler begins to fear the worst during Walt's disappearance and asks for Hank's help in finding him. Hank learns of Walt's involvement with Jesse, but is under the impression that Jesse is simply Walt's weed dealer. At the hideout, Jesse attacks Tuco and he and Walt attempt to flee, right as Hank arrives, having tracked Jesse's car. As Walt and Jesse escape undetected, Hank gets into a shootout with Tuco, which ends with the drug lord's death. Walt fakes falling into a medical fugue state with no memory of his past several days as a cover story for his worried family. Meanwhile, Jesse's car being at Tuco's hideout puts him in the crosshairs of the DEA, which prompts his parents to kick him out of his home, which has their name on the lease. Jesse then moves into a new apartment and falls in love with his neighbor, the building's property manager, Jane Margolis. With Tuco no longer their distributor, Walt and Jesse are forced to sell their meth themselves. Jesse employs his friends Skinny Pete, Badger, and Combo to act as their dealers. When Skinny Pete is robbed by a customer, Walt coldly insists on asserting their power and pressures Jesse into taking violent action against the thief. Jesse discovers that the thieves are a married couple of drug addicts who neglect their young son. As Jesse tends to the child, the wife murders her husband, leaving Jesse distraught and turning harder into drugs for comfort. As Jesse isolates himself in a depressive state, Walt uses the rumor of Jesse murdering the husband Spooge to strike fear in both their customers and rivals and expand their operation. When Badger is caught by the police selling meth, the DEA hopes they can get him to flip and deliver to them the infamous Heisenberg. To get Badger out of police custody and save himself from arrest, Walt hires the shady criminal lawyer Saul Goodman. After successfully clearing Badger and Walt from the DEA's suspicions, Saul becomes Walt's full-time legal counsel and teaches him how to launder his drug money to make it appear legitimate to the government. Meanwhile, still unaware of Walt's burgeoning drug empire, the pregnant Skyler returns to work in order to help support her family. At work, Skyler grows close to her boss, the recently divorced Ted Beneke. When Skyler discovers that Ted is committing major tax fraud with his company, Skyler agrees to help keep his secret. When Walt discovers that his cancer is in remission, he ends his partnership with Jesse and returns to his normal life. But the power he felt as Heisenberg has gone to Walt's head, causing him to act out in bursts of pettiness and aggression. And when copycats tried to encroach on Heisenberg's territory in his absence, Walt's ego drives him to resume his partnership with Jesse and continue the expansion of their drug empire. Elsewhere, Hank gets a promotion at work but begins to suffer from crippling panic attacks. His wife Marie, meanwhile, develops an obsession with shoplifting, despite being financially secure, which causes a strain on her relationship with her sister Skyler. When Combo is killed by a rival dealer, Skinny Pete becomes too scared to deal and quits. And with Badger still under the watch of the DEA, Walt and Jesse are left with no way to sell their meth. Jesse becomes distraught by Combo's death and falls heavier into his meth addiction, while the recovering addict Jane introduces him to heroin. When Walt goes to Saul for help in finding a new distribution partner, the lawyer connects Walt with Gus Fring, the quietly powerful and unassuming owner of a chain of chicken restaurants known as Los Pollos Hermanos, who also just happens to be one of the most powerful and dangerous kingpins in the area. Gus is initially reluctant in working with Walt as he sees Jesse's spiraling drug addiction as a serious liability. To secure his deal with Gus, Walt is forced to miss the birth of his daughter Holly to deliver his first shipment of meth. Instead, Ted accompanies Skyler to the hospital and offers his support. At first, Walt refuses to give Jesse his share of their earnings from their new partnership with Gus, fearing that Jesse would simply use it to fund his and Jane's drug habit. At a bar, Walt has a chance meeting with Jane's father, Donald, who laments about Jane's struggles. Inspired to reconcile with Jesse and help him get truly clean, Walt returns to Jesse's apartment, but finds him and Jane unconscious from a drug binge. As Walt tries to wake Jesse, he inadvertently knocks the sleeping Jane onto her back and she begins to choke on her own vomit. Walt chooses not to help and instead watches as Jane dies. When Jesse wakes the next day and finds Jane dead, he blames himself and falls into his deepest depression yet. Walt chooses to keep his involvement in Jane's death a secret, allowing Jesse to carry his guilt, and then checks his drug-making partner into rehab. Meanwhile, Saul Goodman tasks the professional criminal cleaner Mike Ehrmantraut to clean up the drugs and any evidence tying anyone to Jane's death. As Walt checks himself in for an extended stay in the hospital to fully remove the cancer from his lungs, Skyler uncovers evidence of a long history of lies by her husband. As Walt offers to explain the full truth to Skyler, she can't bear to hear it and instead leaves him. As the season comes to a close, devastated by his daughter's death, Donald becomes distracted at his job as an air traffic controller, inadvertently causing two planes to crash into each other, leading to the deaths of many innocent people, a tragedy that tracks all the way back to Walter White. In season 3 of Breaking Bad, Walt reveals to Skyler that he has secretly been cooking meth and is in fact the infamous Heisenberg. Skyler is shocked and disgusted by this revelation, but promises not to reveal this secret to the authorities, in exchange for Walt signing divorce documents and giving her full custody of their children. When Walt refuses to leave his family, Skyler decides to sleep with Ted and throw her affair in Walt's face. Realizing his drug making has cost him his family, Walt decides to back out of his deal with Gus. Meanwhile, Jesse leaves rehab, clean and sober, but still grieving the death of Jane. He then tasks Saul Goodman to help him buy back his home from his parents. With Walt no longer willing to cook meth with him, Jesse uses all that Walt has taught him to create his own batch of blue sky. Gus agrees to buy Jesse's meth, secretly knowing that Walt's ego will bring him back into the business. Gus then gives Walt a tour of a meticulously crafted underground meth lab for Walt to cook his blue sky product in peace, and makes a final push for Walt to resume their partnership to provide for his family. Walt finally relents, giving Skyler what she wants by moving out of their family home and signing the divorce documents, and agrees to work with Gus Fring in a deal worth millions of dollars. Walt then cuts Jesse out of the deal and ends their partnership for going behind his back and using the blue sky formula without his permission. While working for Gus, Walt is given a new assistant, Gail Bedecker, who is a professional chemist that instantly bonds with Walt over their shared love of science. Meanwhile, the furious Jesse continues making his own knockoff blue sky and teams back up with Skinny Pete and Badger to sell it on the streets. Tuco Salamanca's cousins Lionel and Marco then arrive from Mexico, searching for the infamous Heisenberg to enact their revenge. Gus tasks his professional fixer Mike Ehrmantraut to watch over Walt and his family, then diverts the Salamanca cousins' attention to Tuco's real killer, DEA agent Hank Schrader. Meanwhile, Hank continues his investigation into Heisenberg and discovers evidence connecting Jesse Pinkman to the RV meth lab. As Walt tries to destroy the RV at a junkyard, Jesse arrives, inadvertently leading Hank right to them. Walt and Jesse hide out in the RV, and Walt has Saul's secretary fake a phone call from the hospital to Hank, informing him that Marie had been in a terrible car accident. Hank races to the hospital, allowing Walt and Jesse to destroy the RV and escape without being detected. When Hank realizes he'd been tricked, he blames Jesse and loses control, violently attacking the drug dealer in his home. In order to prevent the petty Jesse from pressing charges on Hank and ruining his career, Walt convinces Gus to fire Gail and bring in Jesse as his meth cooking partner once again. Hank is suspended from the DEA and forced to temporarily turn over his gun and badge, but is is then attacked by the Salamanca cousins. Hank manages to incapacitate Lionel by ramming him with his car, but is gunned down by Marco. As Marco attempts to finish Hank off, the DEA agent manages to use Lionel's gun to kill Marco. Both Hank and Lionel are hospitalized in critical condition, and to hide his involvement in turning the cousins onto Hank, Gus has Mike kill Lionel. When a high-ranking member of the Mexican cartel, Juan Bolsa, calls Gus to demand answers, Gus rats out Juan Bolsa to the Mexican federales, who gun down the cartel leader. The attack on an American DEA agent causes the Mexican government to crack down on drug shipments across the border, leaving Gus to take full control of the drug trade in the area for himself. Following the shootout, Hank is bedridden and told by doctors he may never walk again. As Hank and Marie are left with massive medical debt, Skyler lies about Walt being a compulsive gambler who has accrued millions of dollars playing blackjack, and offers to pay for Hank's medical bills. Skyler then calls off her divorce from Walt to ensure better legal protections for herself, and then helps Walt buy the car wash he previously worked at in order to launder money faster. As Walt and Jesse continue their partnership with Gus, they begin producing a surplus of Blue Sky, which Jesse begins stealing to sell with Badger and Skinny Pete on the side. While selling Blue Sky to members at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, Jesse meets and falls in love with the single mother Andrea, who is raising a young son, Brock. Jesse also learns that Andrea's kid brother Tomas had fallen into a life of crime and drugs, and that he was in fact Combo's killer. When Jesse confronts the gang of kids, he realizes that they are also selling Blue Sky, and therefore must be in Gus's employ. Jesse brings this revelation to Walt, who is dismayed about Gus's dealers hiring kids to sell drugs, but ultimately pleads with Jesse to stand down. Jesse is undeterred and attempts to attack the dealers with a poison called ricin. Jesse is stopped by Mike and one of Gus's enforcers, Victor, and brought to a meeting with Gus and Walt. Gus demands that Jesse stand down and vows to force his dealers to no longer employ children. Jesse agrees to stand down, and Mike warns Walt that Jesse's behavior is a liability to Gus's entire operation. Jesse then learns that because the dealers had no more use for their kid employees, they murdered Tomas. Devastated by this act, Jesse relapses into his old meth addiction and prepares to kill the dealers himself. As a shootout is about to erupt, Walt arrives, killing the dealers and warning Jesse to run. Walt pleads for Gus to allow Jesse to live, which Gus agrees to, though he reinstates Gale as Walt's partner once again, now under the close watch of Victor. Walt realizes that if Gale learns to perfectly recreate the Blue Sky formula, Gus will have no more use for Walt or Jesse. And so Walt devises a plan with Jesse to find and kill Gale, making Walt and Jesse indispensable to Gus. Unfortunately, before Walt can kill Gale, he is captured by Mike and Victor. As Walt pleads for his life, he agrees to turn over Jesse. Mike allows Walt to call Jesse to lure him into a trap, but Walt instead warns Jesse that he needs to kill Gale now. And so, as the season comes to a close, Jesse arrives at Gale's apartment and reluctantly shoots him dead. In Season 4 of Breaking Bad, Victor races to Gale's apartment and forces Jesse back to the meth lab, where he and Walt beg Gus to spare their lives. In response, Gus murders Victor in front of them, sending a message that they both need to be on their best behavior moving forward. Instead of being scared into backing down, Walt buys a gun and plans to use it on Gus, fearing it is only a matter of time before Gus kills him. Mike informs Walt that he is aware of his assassination plot, and then reveals that he will never meet with Gus face to face ever again. Meanwhile, following the murder of Gale, Jesse has fallen back into drugs and depression. Fearing his behavior will be a liability to their operation, Gus and Mike orchestrate a robbery to embolden Jesse and make him feel like a hero. Mike feigns impression in Jesse's skills and asks him to serve as his official backup on supply drops, continuing to make Jesse feel special and give him a purpose. years. As Jesse's new responsibilities pull him away from his work in the lab, Walt realizes that Gus is trying to drive a wedge between the partners. In response, Walt pressures Jesse to use his new position to kill Gus with ricin, which he hides in a cigarette. After learning of Gale's death, Skyler becomes concerned for the safety of Walt and their family. The increasingly prideful Walt insists that he can't be killed due to his importance, and that he is the real danger. Feeling more self-righteous and powerful, Walt splurges on an expensive new car for Walt Jr. Realizing this purchase would draw attention toward their drug money, Skyler allows herself to look like a villain in her son's eyes by forcing Walt to return the car. But Walt isn't the only man in Skyler's life that is being irresponsible with money, as Ted Benecke's tax fraud is finally discovered by the IRS, and Skyler is implicated in the cover-up. Ted is allowed to avoid prison time if he pays off his debts, and so Skyler gives him all of Walt's hidden money, totaling over $600,000. Instead of paying off his debts, Ted decides to buy himself lavish gifts, forcing Skyler to go to Saul Goodman for help. Saul sends his accomplices Huel and Kuby to scare Ted into paying the IRS. But when Ted runs away from the men, he trips and breaks his neck, leaving him permanently paralyzed. As Hank struggles to regain the ability to walk, he falls into a deep depression and begins emotionally shunning his wife Marie. Marie returns to her kleptomania, while Hank becomes obsessed with collecting minerals. In an attempt to pull Hank out of his depression, his police detective friend gives him the lab notes of Gale Boetticher to investigate, discovered in the chemist's apartment after his murder. Hank begins to believe that Gale may have been Heisenberg, but the prideful Walt insists that the lab notes imply Gale was copying someone else's work. This act of ego inspires Hank to continue his investigation, and he discovers a connection between Gale and Los Pollos Hermanos. Emboldened by his renewed desire to catch Heisenberg, Hank begins making progress in his rehabilitation. Hank discovers that Gus's fingerprints were found in Gale's apartment, and also begins investigating the mysterious German parent company of Los Pollos Hermanos, known as Magical Electromotive. Ultimately, the resourceful Gus is able to clear his name with the DEA, but Hank remains suspicious and refuses to back down. Meanwhile, Gus's drug shipments begin being attacked by the Mexican cartel. With the cartel continuing to elevate their hostility toward Gus, he relents in sharing their territory, and promises to send Jesse to Mexico to teach them how to cook blue sky. When Jesse goes to Walt for help, Walt instead admonishes Jesse for failing to kill Gus, leading to the two getting into a brutal fight that severely fractures their relationship. Gus has been planning his takedown of the Mexican cartel for decades, as its leader, Don Eladio, had tasked Hector Salamanca to murder Gus's lover and original meth-cooking partner, Max, and forced Gus into joining them. Now, Gus vows to take down the cartel and make everyone, including the mute wheelchair-bound Hector Salamanca, pay for their past sins. When Gus and Mike take Jesse to Mexico to teach the cartel how to cook blue sky, Gus poisons Don Eladio and all of his top lieutenants, effectively wiping out the entire cartel. When they are attacked by Joaquin Salamanca, Hector's final remaining family, Jesse kills him to save the injured Gus and Mike. Gus takes Jesse to a nursing home to visit Hector Salamanca and gloat that the last of his family is dead, and Gus then honors Jesse's loyalty by naming him as the new head meth cook over Walt. Gus then has Walt kidnapped and taken to the middle of the desert, where Gus fires him and warns that Hank will be killed due to his investigation, and if Walt tries to interfere, Gus will kill his entire family. Walt disobeys Gus's orders and warns the DEA that Hank's life is in danger, then turns to Saul Goodman for help in making his family disappear to live a secret life away from the threat of Gus. When Walt goes to find the $500,000 he needs to pay Saul for the disappearing services, he realizes that Skyler had used the money to pay Ted, and now all of their lives are in grave danger. When Brock, the son of Jesse's girlfriend Andrea, becomes severely ill and hospitalized, Jesse realizes that his ricin-filled cigarette is missing. Walt Walt insists that Gus must have poisoned Brock to frame Walt, driving a further wedge between the former partners. Remembering that Gus had allowed Tomas's death, Jesse believes Walt's claims and teams up with his former partner to kill Gus once and for all. Jesse relays to Walt the only location where Gus lets his guard down, the retirement home of Hector Salamanca. Walt makes a deal with Hector to enact his revenge against Gus, and when Gus goes to visit his old rival, Hector uses the bell on his wheelchair to detonate a bomb which kills them both. With Gus dead, Walt and Jesse continue to tie up their loose ends, burning down the meth lab to prevent the suspicious Hank from discovering it. Jesse then learns that Brock had actually gotten sick from ingesting a poisonous flower known as Lily of the Valley, meaning that Gus had not in fact been the culprit. And as the season comes to a close, it's revealed that Walt had in fact stolen the rice and cigarette and poisoned Brock with Lily of the Valley to manipulate Jesse into aligning with him to kill Gus. In season 5 of Breaking Bad, Saul Goodman is furious with Walt for killing Gus and attempts to break off their business partnership for good. But the increasingly sinister and prideful Walt demands that Saul continues working for him. Saul insists that with Gus gone, Walt can safely retire from cooking meth, but with Skyler using his money to pay for Hank's medical bills and Ted's taxes, he has no money left to retire with. Meanwhile, Mike is also furious over Gus's death, but also warns Walt and Jesse that the DEA are now seriously looking into Gus's operation, which could lead to all of their arrests. With Gus's laptop confiscated in the police station, Walt and Jesse concoct a plan to use an electromagnet to destroy the laptop from outside. Walt then proposes that Mike join himself and Jesse in a new meth operation, but Mike refuses, viewing Walt as too volatile. When the DEA freezes all of Gus's assets, including the $2 million that Mike had stashed away for his granddaughter Kaylee, Mike reluctantly relents and joins Walt's new operation, even blackmailing the shady Madrigal Corporation's executive Lydia Rodarte-Quayle to supply methamphetamine to Walt, just as she had previously done for Gus. And in need of a new location to do their blue sky cooking, Walt, Jesse, and Mike's new business uses the cover of Vominos Pest Control to secretly cook meth in their unsuspecting customers' homes. Meanwhile, Skyler is terrified of the man her husband has become and begins suffering from severe panic attacks. This leads to a brutal confrontation where Skyler admits that she wishes Walt's cancer would come back and kill him. She then has Walt Jr. and Holly stay with Hank and Marie under the guise of marital troubles due to her affair with Ted to keep them away from the dangerous Walt. Elsewhere, Hank gets a promotion in the DEA for his investigation into Gus Fring. While continuing his investigation into the connection between Gus and the mysterious magical electromotive, Hank and the DEA begin planting trackers on Lydia's methylamine shipments, prompting Walt's crew to find another source for the valuable blue sky ingredient. Lydia points Walt toward a train carrying massive quantities of methylamine, and so Walt, Jesse, and Mike stage a train heist alongside criminal Vominos Pest Control employee Todd Alquist. The crew successfully pull off the heist, but as they celebrate, they notice they have been seen by a young boy, who Todd then callously kills with no remorse. Jesse is distraught over Todd's actions, but Walt is shockingly unbothered. This prompts Jesse to finally end his partnership with Walt, while Mike quits to avoid further suspicion during the DEA's investigation. Mike and Jesse want to sell the methylamine to a rival meth dealer, Declan, which would net them all $5 million each. But Walt refuses and hides the methylamine for himself. Walt instead makes a deal with Declan to be his new distributor in exchange for buying out Mike and Jesse's positions in the company. Mike flees to avoid the investigating Hank and the DEA, but Walt refuses to allow Jesse to leave, holding on to his share of the money in the hopes of forcing him into continuing their partnership. Valuing his morals over the money, Jesse ends his partnership with Walt and allows him to keep his share. In turn, Walt is forced to use Todd as his new meth lab assistant. As Mike attempts to flee town, he is forced to trust Walt to deliver to him his go bag with all of his getaway essentials. Before handing over the bag, Walt demands that Mike relay to him the names of all of Gus's incarcerated employees that Mike has been paying off to ensure their silence during DEA interrogations. Mike refuses to betray his former colleagues and admonishes Walt for allowing his ego to ruin everything. In a fit of petty petty rage, Walt shoots Mike, and Mike stoically tells off Walt a final time before dying in peace. Walt then makes a deal with Lydia, who agrees to help him distribute his meth and expand his empire overseas, while also delivering to him the name of Gus's former henchman that Mike had been paying off. Todd introduces Walt to his uncle Jack, a gangster from the Aryan Brotherhood, who Walt pays to have his men viciously kill all of the imprisoned henchmen to ensure their silence. With his empire finally on stable footing, Walt spends the next several months amassing massive amounts of money. Walt begins to contemplate if he finally has enough and attempts to reconcile with Jesse by gifting him the money he was rightfully owed and promising Skyler he is finally ready to quit, leading to them reconciling and bringing Walt Jr. and Holly back home. But this final step toward a happy ending is completely upended when Hank discovers a book dedicated to Walt by none other than Gail Bedecker. And so finally, Hank realizes that his unassuming brother-in-law is in fact the infamous Heisenberg. When Walt realizes that Hank has uncovered his secret identity and is building a case against him, Walt menacingly threatens his brother-in-law. Upon learning of the truth, Marie is devastated that her sister Skyler has been complicit in Walt's crimes. To get Hank to back off and not take his suspicions to the DEA, Walt blackmails him with a faked confession, claiming that Hank was actually the mastermind behind Heisenberg, who forced Walt into cooking meth. And as evidence of Hank's involvement, Walt points out that his drug money was used to pay for Hank's medical bills. Amidst this turmoil, Walt discovers that his cancer has returned, but chooses to keep it a secret from his family. Meanwhile, Declan has been left in charge of both cooking and distributing Blue Sky in Walt's absence. When his quality falls below Lydia's standards, she has Uncle Jack's crew kill Declan so that Todd can take over as the new Blue Sky cook. Fearing Hank's investigation, Walt encourages Jesse to use Saul's contacts to disappear and start a new life elsewhere, with a new name and a clean slate. As Jesse prepares to follow through with this plan, he finally pieces together that Walt had in fact poisoned Brock to manipulate him into turning on Gus. Jesse vows revenge on Walt, leading to both Saul and Skyler suggesting that Walt kill his former partner, but Walt refuses. In turn, Jesse agrees to work with Hank and his partner Steve Gomez to gather the evidence needed to prove Walt is Heisenberg and lock him up for the rest of his life. Jesse devises a plan to trick Walt into believing that Jesse has found his hidden stash of money and threatens to burn it all. As Walt races to the spot he buried his money in the desert, he angrily rants about all of the crimes he has committed to leave a fortune for his family after he is gone. Walt also finally relents and hires Jack and his gang to kill Jesse once and for all. But when Walt arrives in the desert, he realizes the ruse, as Jesse, Hank, and Gomez arrive, revealing that they've recorded his confession and arrest him. Walt accepts defeat and calls Jack to stand down before being loaded into the back of Gomez's car. As Hank calls Marie to celebrate his victory, Jack and his gang arrive, ignoring Walt's orders to stand down. Despite Walt's pleas, Jack and his men murder Hank and Gomez and then steal most of Walt's money. Defeated, the spiteful Walt insists that Jack and his gang carry out their hit on Jesse, but Todd suggests they instead kidnap Jesse and force him to cook meth for them. Walt accepts this arrangement, but not before heartlessly revealing to Jesse that he had allowed Jane to die. To ensure Jesse's cooperation, Todd murders Andrea, and Jack threatens to murder Brock. Walt then returns to his home, where he frantically tries to convince his family to pack their things and join him to start a new life elsewhere. Skyler realizes that Walt's actions have gotten Hank killed and threatens Walt to leave at knife point. As Walt attacks Skyler, Walt Jr. intervenes, attacking his own father and calling the police. Realizing he has lost his family, Walt makes a phone call, knowing the police would be recording it, and claims that Skyler was unaware of his drug empire in order to protect her from any criminal charges. Walt then meets with Saul's contact Ed Galbraith, who helps him disappear and gain a new identity, living in seclusion in New Hampshire. After months of living alone and forced to confront his sins, Walt prepares to turn himself over to the authorities. But first, he calls his son to inform him that he'd be sending the remainder of his money. Walt Jr. says that he has changed his name to Flynn and that he wishes his father would die. Before Walt can turn himself over to the authorities, he sees a television interview with Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, where they attempt to distance the Gray Matter Company from the criminal Walter White. His ego sparked once again, Walt abandons his surrender and returns to Albuquerque to end things on his own terms. Walt threatens Elliot and Gretchen to set up a trust in Flynn's name and ensure that he receives the remainder of Walt's fortune. Walt then visits Lydia and finally uses the ricin from Jesse's cigarette, poisoning her and ensuring her imminent death. Next, Walt visits Skyler for a final time, admitting that despite his claims for becoming Heisenberg to provide for his family, it was actually to satisfy his own pride. Walt then says a final goodbye to his family and heads to Jack's compound for a final confrontation. As Jack, Todd, and their gang of Aryan Brotherhood members surround Walt and bring out the broken Jesse, Walt tackles his old partner to the ground and activates a machine gun that kills all of Jack's men. Amidst the chaos, Jesse kills Todd, while Walt shoots Jack dead. Walt was injured in the gunfire and asks Jesse to finish him off, but Jesse refuses. Instead, the two former partners bid each other a reluctant farewell. As Jesse flees, Walt succumbs to his injuries, accepting his imminent death and finally content with all that he has accomplished.